Hi, my name is Keith Fries, and here are some of my ideas for the first nine. So, to start, I've seen different articles over the years with Kurt Sutter saying that he may or may not start the series in Vietnam. Now, personally, I don't think that that needs to happen for a couple reasons. To start, I would say that there are a handful of movies and television shows that have done footage of Vietnam. And I don't want to say that the footage here for this movie might feel repetitive, but it may not feel as original. And secondly, I don't think that it's necessary to start in Vietnam when, if you think back with Sons of Anarchy, even though we never met John Teller, we knew so much about him, his writings, how his voice sounded, what he kind of looked like. But we were introduced to Piney, Lenny, and Keith, who were the first four members of the group. So the movie would start with John Teller, Piney, Lenny, and Keith outriding, and it would kind of play into what John Teller wanted the group to be, which was just this kind of free spirit, come back from Vietnam, kind of have undiagnosed PTSD, getting it out of your system, not going to your job because jobs weren't being offered to those soldiers when they came back, just kind of living that free life outriding. So when they're out riding, they end up going to this concert, kind of a smaller concert in the park. And when they get to the concert, they end up bumping into a guy named Ben Keene and a group called the Colorful Vandals. My backstory for how I came up with the name Colorful Vandals is that one day when they were at a corner market or like a gas station market, the Colorful Vandals show up. They're kind of not right in the head, and they start, dancing on the countertops, and they're singing and then whatever. And they ultimately ended up stealing some goods from the store. So a newspaper article comes out about the event, and in the newspaper it said this group of colorful vandals. And so they kind of take on that name and adopt it for themselves. I'm kind of drawing from real life where you had the Merry Pranksters and there was a member named Gut Turk who later became an angel. And I'm going the other way with it where Wally Grazer and Tom Whitney started as colorful vandals but later became members of the Sons of Anarchy. Gut Turk was a graphic artist and he would put together these really intricate designs. And how I kind of picture it in my head is that JT, Piney, Lenny, and Keith start with this certain old graphic on their cuts, as you can see here on the screen. But later on, when Wally and Tom join the group, Wally uses his graphic art to design the current and well-known design of the Sons of Anarchy middle rocker. So for the first half of the movie, we're kind of seeing the Sons of Anarchy, how John Teller really wanted the group to be. Very fun-loving, very enthusiastic, kind of hippie, hanging out with the Colorful Vandals and Ben Keene and going to these parties and concerts and really being the life of the whole event. But when we get to the midpoint, I had this idea of doing kind of a callback to Sons of Anarchy where Opie had his wedding and I could see Piney having a wedding at the midpoint. Now, what happens at the midpoint is that ultimately one of the Colorful Vandals ends up dying, and it's because he got into a skirmish with some of the Sons of Anarchy members. The Sons of Anarchy members kind of cover it up, or they try to, not make it a big thing. And while this event is happening, John Teller is out hanging out with Ben Keene and the Colorful Vandals, partying, kind of naive to the whole event. And the whole point of this event happening is because you need to start transitioning from the group having that sort of fun-loving hippie thing that John Teller had into a more physical, intimidating vibe that the Sons of Anarchy would later become, where Clay Morrow would thrive in that environment. So after the midpoint, the Sons kind of have this nasty reputation starting to build up. They start going to protests for Vietnam and they're in support of going to war and they're kind of doing all these different things. And they're really starting to rub the hippies the wrong way. And they're kind of having a falling out with the Colorful Vandals, etc. Now, of course, as the movie goes on, we're also adding in Chico and Otto and Clay into the mix and we're fully establishing the group as a whole. But I kind of see there being sort of divisions happening in the early part of the second act where the more physical, intimidating members of the group are starting to kind of hang out together, and the more fun-loving guys are starting to kind of trend or hold on to what they thought the vision of the club was. Interestingly enough, if you look at the first 9 photo, you'll notice that it's almost split down the middle, where on the right side, John Teller, Keith, Chico, and Piney are all in a group together, and the other 5 members are all off on their own side. And Clay and JT are kind of facing off away from one another, almost kind of showing where the divide really was. And in a group where there's 9 members and it's democracy and it's voting, that 5-4 is going to override the 4, and therefore there's going to be a lot more violence and intimidation rather than the fun-loving hippie thing that JT had intended on from the beginning. So we see these events playing out throughout the second act, where the group is starting to get a little bit more physical, a little bit more challenging to the hippie movement. And I end up seeing Piney and JT kind of having this weird falling out around the end of Act 2, where there's sort of this setback thing happening, or a real problem between the two, where Piney sees where the club is going. He sees that it's starting to become more violent, and he's okay with it, whereas JT really isn't. JT doesn't like how it's progressing, to the point where maybe you end up having Piney sew on the new Sons of Anarchy logo, or the one that we are more familiar with, and sewing over that over the old patch that he had. So it's almost kind of like Piney transitioning into this new phase of Sons of Anarchy, where JT's trying desperately to hold on to the original idea of the club. So then we get into Act 3, and I think that JT ends up having this kind of destiny run type thing happen, where he ends up kind of leaving the club, not officially saying he's quitting the club, but he just goes on a destiny run and he tries to clear his head. And when he's out there, that's when he meets Clay. I see his bike kind of having some trouble or some kind of mechanical problem, and he ends up bumping into Clay, who's this young guy, probably only about 16 or 17 years old. And Clay fixes his bike because he's just this mechanical savant, this wunderkind of a mechanic. So they get to talking. Clay, tells him, hey, you're in Sons of Anarchy. I was just reading in the newspaper that you guys are doing security for an upcoming concert. So for all you Sons of Anarchy buffs that have read different backstories for some of the first 9 characters, we know that Little Otto started getting the Sons of Anarchy into doing security for different high-profile musicians. And we would see these musicians throughout the story, because they're hanging out with Ben Keene and the Colorful Vandals and then the Sons. So Clay is mentioning this to JT, and JT is really unaware of the concert, but Clay says, it sounds like it's going to get out of hand, and it sounds like you're going to need extra people. Why don't I go with you? When they get there, things are already chaotic. It's probably about halfway through the day with the concert, and you can just tell things are unraveling. So when they get there, JT and Piney kind of have this sort of weird balancing act of approaching one another and forgiving one another. But ultimately, somebody tries to attack Piney, and JT helps Piney or rescues him or, takes the hit for him. And this is JT realizing that in order to have his best friend, that there is always going to be violence or intimidation or the risk factor of your health being, put on the line. And so therefore there is always going to be that sort of thing hanging around. I think there was some kind of quote within Sons of Anarchy from JT's manuscript where he said basically what I just said, which is that if you're a man of convictions, violence is inevitable. So this is kind of the realization that brings JT back into the fold. He understands that the group does have to evolve, and they do have to get tougher, and they do have to start doing things that he may not necessarily had seen in the very beginning of the formation of the group. And because of that, that's when you have the group as a unit at the very end, kind of ride off into the sunset. Either way, thank you for tuning into this. These were just a couple ideas I had. I'm sure that there's other things that I've thought of that I am completely forgetting to mention. But either way, thank you. I do appreciate it. It's very possible that we may never get the first 9, but in a more optimistic sense, there's money to be made by doing the first 9. So my hope isn't totally lost. For all you Sons of Anarchy fans, keep praying that we eventually get the first 9. Thanks.